Well, good afternoon and welcome along to the Pastor's Heart. My name is Dominic Steele and it's great that you could join us this afternoon. Now, coming up over the next couple of weeks, next week on the 15th of May, we're going to be joined by Andrew Beddoe. He's really leading the way for our community of churches on how do we better reach everyday people. He's thinking particularly about the tradies, the factory workers, the retail workers, those on social welfare benefits, that group of people that make up 74% of the Australian population but is underrepresented in our church. He'll be speaking at a conference this weekend in Sydney, and we've got him on the Pastor's Heart next Tuesday. The following week, we're going to be joined by Sandy Galea. Now, Sandy's married to Ray Galea. Together they pastor Rudy Hill Church in the western suburbs of Sydney, and I asked her to come and talk to me a few months ago, and she's actually our first repeat guest on the Pastor's Heart, and I said, come and talk to us about ministry and ministry teams. But then as we were talking about the heart of the pastor, she opened up about the journey of helping pastor children through grief. And I said, actually, that's more interesting. Let's talk about that. And so we had her a little while ago talking about children and grief, but she's coming back now on my original request to talk about how do you organise the teams in not just in children's ministry, but the teams across the church. And so I think you're going to find that really interesting on the week of the 22nd of May. And then the following week, Mikey Lynch is joining us, and we're going to be discussing the whole issue of sacrificing all for Jesus. Zealously, and then what happens when you do that and hit a wall? And so he's going to be joining us. He's a significant thought leader in the Australian Christian community from down in Tasmania. He's going to be up here in Sydney, and we're looking forward to having him in the last week in May. Today, though, we're talking resilient ministry, and it's really exciting for us to have Donald Guthrie with us. Donald really knows what he's talking about because he's done a 7-year study on the whole issue of clergy burnout, resilience. He's speaking this afternoon at a conference for the Anglican Education Commission at Moore College, but to ministers from across the place, and that's terrific. And it's really good that just before you go to that conference, you've been able to sneak in here.
Sure.
And,
happy to be here.
We're delighted to have you. Donald is from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and it's a longitudinal study, 7-year study.
Yes.
And a fortnight ago, I was on holidays and I got your book, and I got to the bit about lessons in leadership towards the back of the book, and there was stuff about educating pastors and things about continuing education and coaching and evaluation instruments and varied experiences. But then the argument went, the biggest education factor is hardship followed by reflection. I just thought we might start with you on kind of your own journey on learning through hardship and reflection on that. Yeah.
Well, we've had in my family over the years a number of particular challenges with our children, with our parents, with ourselves, illness, untimely death, various kinds of physical challenges as well. And we got to the end of ourselves pretty quickly, even as strong Christians in God's kindness as we are. And I think it's deepened our resolve to both pay attention to what the Lord's doing in our own lives, to abide in Him, to stay close to Him, but also how it animates us to be empathetic toward others going through difficult circumstances. I think the Lord's used it as our own curriculum, our own sanctification curriculum, if you will.
Right. Do you think it was just that difficulty and that difficult journey you went through that then, I mean, obviously you now have spent years thinking about other men and women in the pastoral ministry going through hard things. Was it your own journey that kind of got you into that? Or?
I think it was a large contributor. It was also a number of colleagues agreeing with the Lilly Endowment, who funded the study that we did and other institutions did, that noticed on a really massive scale that the church and pastors in particular were really suffering, and what could we all do about it. So we decided to pitch in to see what we could learn and contribute.
Now, this 7-year study that you've done with a couple of colleagues, and it's in the book now, Resilient Ministry. I'm going to jump in on the issue of family, and I'm just going to drop a quote. A few years ago, I asked my wife, now this is not me, this is the person in the book, I asked my wife what it felt like to be married to me after 20 years of marriage and 18 years of ministry together. I was optimistic of her positive response. She said, "I can't answer you right now. Give me some time to think about it." A few weeks later, I approached her again. "Have you thought about what it feels like to be married to me?" She replied, "Yes. I know that I'd never divorce you, and I certainly would never kill you. However, I can't help but think the boys and I would be better off if you were not alive." My response: I was ready to leave the ministry in order to save my marriage. I went to my elders, told them what my wife had said. I told them I thought I should leave the ministry to save my marriage. After some quiet moments, one of the elders finally spoke and said, "No, now is not the time for you to leave the ministry. Now is the time for you to learn what ministry is about." With their support, my wife and I began extended counselling, and it's resulted in pretty dramatic changes in the way I live life and do ministry. Yeah. Tell us about that guy, and tell us about how you've been able to help him, and what you tell people to stop them getting there.
Well, externally, that couple at the time would have been considered to be some of the most exemplary among pastoral families. So it was a shock basically to everybody when that came out. It was a shock to them. It was obviously a shock to him, but also a shock to all of us. That has become a regular part of their personal and team testimony. I've heard them tell the story many times, actually, as the elders surrounded them, said, "No, actually, now you're maybe finally ready. You weren't teachable, now you are. You weren't really very humble to the pastor, now maybe you are." It was a remarkable, pretty difficult challenge, obviously, from his wife to him. But they have stayed together and are stronger than ever, and now are among the finest mentors of all the pastoral couples that we know.
Yeah, I read that book in the book, and then I went and read that quote to my wife, because I thought I can't credibly put it out here unless I've...
Yeah.
And we had a good discussion, and she said she didn't think she'd ever felt like that, but she said there were times when I would go away and be away for a week speaking at a conference or something like that, and life in the house would be calm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she found herself not looking forward to me coming back. And I remember her telling me that years ago, and us working on changes. And it wasn't quite as dramatic, but I suspect this is a dramatic story, but I suspect there'd be quite a few pastoral couples that would have echoes of that story.
Yeah, anytime anybody would come forward with a story like this, and I agree, that was at the extreme end of the stories, but almost always when we would be gathered in the cohorts for sharing and prayer, and one person would lead out, the head nods would be almost universal.
Yeah.
And everybody, of course, would think that they were the only ones who were feeling this until they discovered that actually this is very common.
What are some of the things you're saying pastors need to do to improve family life? And in terms of, there's some that are for every married couple, but there are some specific to the pastorate.
Well, one of the things we talk about is, both in the book and then when we talk out with pastors and families, is to find some sort of healthy tension of prioritizing but not idolizing the family and children and spouses and relationships in general. And obviously that's a very challenging thing to do for all of us. But what we mean by that is, generationally, in our context, U.S., we found that boomer age pastors have basically, broad brush, sacrificed lots and lots of people and things for pastoral ministry, including family. Younger folks entering pastoral ministry have looked at this and said, none of that.
Yeah.
We don't want anything to do with that. They've gone all the way over to this way, very protective, very hands-off. So neither extreme we've observed is very healthy or fruitful. What we're trying to discover are these healthy patterns of boundaries, recognition, communication to the congregation, support, a rhythm of ministry that honors the Sabbath, a rhythm of ministry that honors the family without, again, idolizing them for anybody. And we found that to be actually helpful, not just for the pastors and their families, but also as they kind of bring the congregation in on the conversation. This is healthy for everybody. These places where we can help one another think through these things of prioritization, but not idolization.
How do you help where the spouse feels abandoned by their spouse who's always on the job?
We found that to be maybe the most both surprising finding from the study, but the reason why it was surprising is because the other studies that were going on around the U.S. at the same time found very similar things. And that wasn't a small scale. I mean, eventually, the study that we participated in touched 10% of all the pastors in the United States. So that was a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a lot of
people.
people.
A lot of people.
Yeah.
Our study was a small bit of it, but
Yeah.
it eventually reached lots. So to have that finding corroborated by all those other institutions doing very similar work, I think was startling to everybody. And it led to the beginnings of some networks for faculty, for pastor spouses. It led to particular programs and outreach and support groups for faculty. I keep saying faculty, sorry. Pastor spouses, not just for pastors.
Yep.
Because it was this heretofore kind of untapped reality that the spouses were perhaps burning out at a rate faster than the pastor.
pastors,
Yeah.
And no one was to do that for their wife. Do you know?
No.
Yeah. One of the issues you zeroed in was who is the spouse to talk to?
Exactly, right.
Tell us about that.
Right.
Yeah.
So the most, at least for me personally, the most profound quote in the whole study was when, and I can remember when it happened, was a spouse saying they felt like a nuclear waste dump. So that they could absorb what the pastor was telling them, but then they had no offload. They had no opportunity to talk to anybody about what they were absorbing from the pastor, who didn't also have anybody to talk to, unfortunately. And that was the moment when I remember happened to be a woman. She thought she was the only person who felt that way, and every other person in the group agreed that that's how they felt.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a moment, a come to Jesus moment, I think, for the group and for the whole group, particularly. Of now what? Now what? How do we all deal with this?
Yeah. I mean, you do talk about, quite early in the book, about how few people pastors have as friends to be confidence with. And
Right.
you use this language, and allies and confidence.
That's right, right.
Now,
Right.
for those who don't know those terms, allies and confidence, can you just explain that? Because I found it really helpful.
Yes, we did too, actually. It comes from Heifetz and Linsky at Harvard in some of their work in adaptive leadership. And the distinction between allies and confidence would be that allies are more plenteous in number, but not as in-depth in understanding and commitment to you. So you're with them, you're for one another. You need lots of them, we all do, and pastors too. Confidants, on the other hand, very few in number, not just in a particular time and particular context, but over the course of our lives we have very few confidants. And the biggest mistake we all make is when we think
that an ally is a confidant.
Exactly. And our research bore that out, but also much other research has been done on how that leads to, for example, forced exits in churches. Because the ally can't take it. They can't absorb what you're telling them. No, not at all.
And as I read the chapter, I thought, I think my allies are telling me that they're confidents. As I'm reading it, and I'm thinking about it from my own perspective. You know, I've got allies around, and they say, "Oh, you can trust me, you can talk to me." But actually, when I think about it, they're not really confidents; they're really allies. You know, and so just that distinction between people, I found super helpful. Now, I want to go though to emotional intelligence.
Okay.
That's a big theme of yours in this book. What is emotional intelligence, as opposed to other kinds of intelligence?
It's the ability and the capacity to understand yourself in relationship to others, and neither be projecting yourself on others, nor having others projected on yourself.
Yep.
So I guess for a Christian, you would say it's security in Christ. It's a sense of, I am proximately content, in this side of eternity, with who the Lord's made me, how He's sanctifying me, to the point where the fruit of the Spirit manifests itself so that I am not projecting, I am not manipulating, but I am staying connected with others. And that makes all the difference in the world when you're trying to communicate, and when you're trying to empathize, and when you're trying to not just counsel, but even you're preaching. We found the more that the pastors told us that they were emotionally healthy, the better relationships were in general, the better communication was, the better understanding was, the better harmony was throughout the whole system.
Now, it's a slightly different term, emotional healthy versus emotional intelligence. Are you talking about them as the same kind of thing? Because when you say emotional intelligence, when you say emotional health, I think kind of, am I well in my head? Do you know? Whereas when I think emotional intelligence, I'm thinking my read on people and my read on myself.
And that's true, but that resonance comes from first your own sense of yourself.
Right.
So that what is not projected, but what is communicated to others is healthy as well. So they really go hand in hand. It's both self and others.
And one question I had, as I was thinking about some people who've started out in pastoral ministry, either started out at the seminary or theological college, and then at the end of seminary or theological college chosen not to go into pastoral ministry, or they've started out and they've gone through a number of jobs, but they've not really settled in the long term. Some of my friends who and I don't think I'd particularly thought of it in that category before I read this book, but as I was reading the book, I thought, actually, I'm not sure that some of them score that high on the emotional intelligence. And some of them actually read for themselves, actually, I might have gone top of the class in the, theology essay, but actually in terms of my pastoral read on people, I've got...
Yes, we found that over and over again, that the same systems which send folks to seminary, train folks in seminary, and then receive back those who've been trained, for example, in seminary. It's a mixed bag whether or not emotional intelligence has been factored in and accounted for in the curriculum and co-curricular activities.
Differentiation in the pastoral ministry. One of the quotes in the book is, differentiation is the hardest thing for me. It's so difficult for me to actually uncover who I am. What do I really want? What do I really like? It's frequently easy for me to be a chameleon in stressful or intimidating situations. Being able to say what I want is difficult to determine with any degree of confidence. Talk to me about differentiation. Yeah.
Well,
that seems really important.
Yeah, it's very important. It comes from family systems theory, as well as obviously the fruit of the Spirit. We just heard so many of the pastors in the study talk about that very thing. It's another one of those places where one person might have said it, but everybody agreed. Trying to project a persona, trying to be someone that perhaps they weren't or they aspired to be, but couldn't figure out how to get there. It was just seemed to be so common. And remember, these folks were vetted very carefully because they were generally speaking in pretty good emotional, spiritual, physical health, and they ended up being not out of distress, obviously, and struggling, but I think the difference with them was that they had a lot of self-awareness that led to differentiation. So they could understand themselves and their struggles, but not carry that so much into the ministry so that they kept projecting on others. I'm feeling depressed, so are you.
Right,
I'm feeling insecure, so you must be too. And when they said they were at their best, when they actually listened to their parishioners and they didn't project, and that's a lot of the heart of differentiation.
Okay, so in 60 seconds, how do I get better at differentiation?
I would say the way you get better at anything is practice with feedback.
Yeah.
So who's in your team who can help, and literally practice with some feedback, role play, and then take it into live conversation, and also modeling and apprenticeship, you might say. So find those who are actually mature and skilled, and go stand by their chariot a bit and say, can you help me increase and deepen in this area? It's not a trait. It's not either or. You're not born with it or not. I mean, the Holy Spirit's developing, and it is a skill, but it does take work. I mean, it's intentional.
You've just caught my attention with the word role play. Can you teach me a bit of role play on how to get better at differentiation?
Yes, so I'm one of your parishioners, and I'm coming to see you because I'm struggling at work. And I'm struggling at work because I'm confused about how to be a Christian at work. So the thing that we would hope that you wouldn't say is, well, when I was at work, I did this. So you do the same. We would hope that you would listen and ask clarifying questions so that you could empathize and get to the point where you could provide counsel and prayer that was based on what you listened for and to, not listened for advantage so that you could tell me what to do without actually accounting for me and my specific problem. So the role play would be that sort of scenario, and then we have maybe a third person on the team here listening and watching, and then we'd all get debriefed about how it all went.
Right.
Okay, let's try it this time, this different way this time. Okay, let's try it this way, let's try this again.
Right.
So you anticipate before you get in the actual situation instead of it's cold to you. This is obviously particularly effective for pre-service training. To help those who are training so that it does not take them completely by surprise when they get in the real situation.
Spiritual growth. What did you find about pastors and their own individual spiritual growth?
Well, the most common thing they would say was actually about their own worship. They felt often that they were divided in worship, is how they described it. They felt like they planned worship, they attended worship, they led worship, were, but they weren't sure all the time they were actually worshiping.
Because I'm thinking so much about the admin and who's going to pray at the end of this song.
Oh, look what happened there, and somebody walked by, and this and this. And
we're running late and I'm not preaching yet.
Absolutely. So they had really struggled with even knowing how to process that feeling. They just felt guilty. They felt, I'm a failure. I must be the only person this ever happened to. Of course they weren't. Part of the strength of the cohort model of peer reflection together was just to share things exactly like this. Now, on the other hand, they said when they built in practices and when they built in rhythms, they were absolutely at their best in Christ, at their strongest. And it was those times that were monitored and shared with others close to them and also off-site, so their confidants, in a sense, off-site. No question they were doing the best that they were doing.
Now, what's the difference between the peer group and having just a group of colleagues on your staff team? Do you know,
I'd probably say the intentionality of particularly peer group outside your system. That's key. You can go so far with your team on site in your own context, but you can go to different places, you can go to different depths with peers outside your system, so that's what everybody has in common.
And if the peer group was outside your system, I guess aspirationally the peer group would be not allies but rather confidants.
That'd be ideal. That's right.
And okay.
We actually would, I would say, carefully and not absolutize this, but say it's very rare to have confidants inside your system as pastors. Some would go beyond that and say it's not even wise to. I would say it depends. Let's listen for a longer time before I would say to anybody, Dominic, don't even try to have any confidants in your system. It's a recipe for disaster. I'm not sure I'd say that.
When you say system, I take it you mean within the congregation, within the staff team. But I'm presuming you also mean kind of like within the bishops, the episcopacy, the denominational structure above you.
Could be. It could be. You need to even go outside there.
Yeah. To actually just somebody who you can trust who's, I mean, they could be a peer of a minister of a different church, but they're not. Well, even then, would you...
That would be more often the case who the profile would fit. Yes,
Right.
that's right.
Okay. Now, I was also fascinated by what you said about over-functioning and under-functioning systems of a church, and often the pastor will be over-functioning, the church under-functioning. He moves to try and pull himself back and get them to step up, and the shenanigans that they go through to get him to start over-functioning again.
Sure.
Can you just
Sure.
describe that? I've given it in logic, but maybe you could just give it in
Sure.
a picture, an illustration. And
Yeah. So many of the pastors talked about how their expectation of their leadership was that they would be the be-all and end-all of everything. So the congregation could not decide to do anything without them. They couldn't maybe make any decision. I mean, it was just extreme. And some would say, I encouraged it, I the pastor, and the congregation encouraged it. It was a perfect storm. And the more I ratcheted up, the more they expected. The more they expected, the more I ratcheted out. And it led closer and closer and closer to burnout. So that they had to do a reboot at some point with expectations and communications and rhythms, so that not just they would be more healthy, which they needed to be, but so that they could build that rhythm into the congregation.
Yeah. How do you do that reboot?
Real life,
Yeah.
it's usually forced sabbatical.
Right.
It's usually, if it gets to that point, it's usually a forced sabbatical.
But what if I'm just kind of in the system and I'm feeling like I've written the talk, I've got to church an hour and a half early, I've been running around, I've cleaned up the mess, I've done this, and I had in my mind that I'd really like to start talking to people and chatting nicely to them half an hour before the service started, but in fact I'm still running around until 29 minutes past and I'm just stressed. What do I do?
So first thing I would ask is, who else knows about that? And the pastor would often say, well, nobody. Why would I share those with anybody? Well, I'd say, well, are there mechanisms in place, are there people in place whose either role it would be to help with that, or could something be created to address those kinds of things, to both relieve pressure for the pastor, but also relieve pressure overall in the system, because what happens to you keeps radiating out into the system. So I think I'd ask those kinds of questions. What is the system already designed to produce this kind of dysfunction? Does it have to be that way? What else could be done? And do a bit of brainstorming that way.
I think we'd also say we've actually got a pastor's heart from Rhett Harris from a couple of months ago on how to reboot the whole philosophy of ministry.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because that needs a bomb put in it, that philosophy.
It does, yeah. Sometimes that's necessary.
And yet, I've been through seasons where our church looked, I mean, not recently, but a long time ago, our church looked like that, and we needed that bomb put in the place.
And sometimes, actually I'd say maybe even oftentimes, it takes some help from the outside to invite a colleague, invite someone outside the system to come in and ask those questions and to just offer help.
Yeah.
Just to give a perspective that's different than everybody that you can't see because you're so deep into it.
In it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about this whole burning on or burning out? Let's finish with the issue of burnout.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, for the first time, this study, I would say, represented other studies, represented other attention. We've known more about burnout historically in the church and with pastors than we knew about anything resembling resilience and health. This was a bit of a shift, a major shift to focus on, well, can we go find some health to figure out how to not replicate, but at least pay attention to, rather than just the burnout. I think it's given us a new language to think about, not just the inevitability of burnout, how to avoid burnout and do it the kind of the pathogenic approach. I've come upon some folks in the healthcare industry who talk about something called salutogenic approach. It's the healthy approach. It's the what can we pay attention to that's healthy, that leads to well-being, to flourishing, and how can we, with realistic hope, I mean, without Pollyannish ideas of just do this and you're fine, but how can we work towards developing practices and rhythms and in the system and personally, so that we nurture gospel health, not just inevitable burnout. So that's what we were trying to say. It's not inevitable. It's not you're doomed. Welcome to the pastor. You're doomed to fail, and you're doomed to feel terrible pretty soon. Why? Why is that the case? He said, well, maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Donald, thanks so much for coming and
Thank
speaking
you,
to us this
Dominic.
afternoon.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Blessings.
Donald Guthrie has been my guest. He's from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago in the United States. We've been talking about the book Resilient Ministry that he and a couple of colleagues have produced, a longitudinal study, really helpful book. Next week on The Pastor's Heart, we're looking at the whole issue of everyday people with Andrew Beddoe, and I hope that you can join us then, and we'll be thinking about how do we reach that 74% of the population that really evangelicals are not very good at communicating with. Thanks for joining us this week.